All right, guys, so jumping, this is video 3. And number 8 says use f of x equals x squared plus 4 and g of x equals x minus 3 to find f plus g of x. So f of x, let's write it in red. That's going to be x squared plus 4. Let's write the g of x in blue. That's going to be, and they want us to add them together. So g of x is x minus 3, and they want us to add it together. So here's your, I guess it's important to put them in parentheses, but right here it's not really necessary because of the plus sign. It's not going to change anything. The plus sign is just combining like terms. So if I do combine my x squared, I can't combine it with anything else. I just bring that down. But let me bring down the x next. That's a positive x. And the positive 4 and the negative 3, that'll give me a positive 1 at the very end. And there's my answer for A. Now for B, it's a little bit more, For B, it's more important that you do use parentheses. Once again, let's do our G in blue. So they're saying G of x minus f of x. So G of x is, I want to do G in blue, x minus 3, put in parentheses, and then there's a minus sign, and then I need to write my f of x, and my f of x, I want to go with red. So my f of x is going to be x squared plus 4. So right here, it's very important that you put parentheses because it'll help you remember to take that minus sign and to distribute it to both terms. So you're really going to have x minus 3. There's nothing to distribute, so you don't need the parentheses. But then you're going to have a minus x squared and then a minus 4. The only thing left to do is to put it in order in standard form. So you're going to end up with negative x squared. On this guy, you're going to end up with negative x squared and then plus x because of the positive x. And then the minus 3 and the minus 4, that's going to give you a minus 7. So that's the answer for B. So C is a little bit more interesting because it's written in that certain notation, F little circle G. That means F of G. So the first thing I would do to understand it better is to rewrite it as F of G of X. So what this means is that you're going to take your G of X function and plug it inside your F of X function. So you're going to take the x minus 3 and plug it inside the x squared plus 4. So it'd be a good idea to start by rewriting x squared plus 4 as parentheses squared plus 4, and then actually plugging in the g of x function into it, x minus 3. Now this does require a lot more work because you're going to have to square the binomial, which means you're going to write it twice, x minus 3, x minus 3. And of course, you're going to have the plus 4 at the very end. You're going to distribute x times x squared, x times negative 3 is negative 3x, and negative 3 times x is negative 3x again, which when you combine it gives you a total of negative 6x. And then negative 3 times negative 3 is positive 9. But don't forget about the plus 4 at the very end. So your final answer will be x squared minus 6x plus 13. That's the final answer for that one on part C. So jump into part D. Now this one right here, it is a multiplication symbol right there. So you're going to take f of x and multiply it by g of x. So you're simply going to write f of x times g of x. They're both binomials, so you have to write them in parentheses. And from there, obviously, we're going to distribute, my phone's ringing. Let's distribute x squared times x, that's x to the third. X squared times negative 3, that's negative 3x squared. Positive 4 times x, that's a positive 4x. Positive 4 times negative 3, that's a negative 12. Ladies and gentlemen, there is nothing to combine. It's a cubic polynomial. We are done. Let's move on to the next one. On this next one, they're asking us to state the domain and the range of the function shown. So they give you, this is a square root function. I don't know if you could see that. It says y equals the square root of x minus 1 plus 2. We could clearly see the h and the k. The h is positive 1 from the origin. The k is positive 2. So that's the beginning point. And it does shoot off in this direction, curving, forever going up and forever going to the right. So it's always going up and it's always going to the right. So we know that in terms of the y values, right? It's right here at the y equals 2, and it's definitely above the y equals 2. And in terms of the x values, here's the x value of 1, and we know that it's on that side of x equals 1, which means that it's greater than x equals 1. So you need to know that in order to be able to state your domain and range. Let's talk about domain. Your domain are your x values. So what about the x values when you're talking about starting here and going this way forever? X values are left and right. So obviously it doesn't go to the left. It starts at the x value of 1 and it goes that way forever. So what do you say? X is what? Anybody? Come on, people. X is greater than 1. That's the domain. Yes? Okay. How about the range values? Now, the range values are the y values. So we're going to say y is what? Now, you guys could clearly see that it starts right here and it goes, does it go down from there or does it go up from there? It goes up. So what's the range value? The y's have to be what? They have to be what? Greater than 2. And you know what? I did make a mistake. This dot right here is not an open dot. It's an actual solid dot. It's not an open dot. So it's because it's solid, it is including that value. So we have to go back to these inequalities and say x is greater than or equal to 1 and y is also greater than or equal to 2. Does that make sense? So there's going to be some multiple choice answers with domain and range like that also on the final. How about this one? This one is a square root function that got reflected over the x-axis and got shifted 2 units to the right, 1 unit up. But that's not important. What's important is that we were able to state the domain and range. So let's talk about domain, the x values. So the x-axis runs left and right. So does this graph go to the left forever? Yes, it does. It's missing that arrow, but it does go to the left forever. It goes this way forever. Does it go that way forever? Heck no, it doesn't go that way at all. So in terms of your x values, x goes to the left. Left is less. So we're talking about x has to be less than or equal to, because that's a solid dot right there. It's less than or equal to 2. How about the range? The range are your up and down values. Does this graph go up forever? Heck no, right? It starts here and it goes down forever. So if it starts here at this level, what's that y level? That's y is what? Y is 1. So y has to be what? 1 or less. So y has to be less than or equal to 1. I hope this makes sense. Does it? Number 10, find the inverse. Find the inverse. Find the inverse. Anyway, what is find the inverse? You have to switch x and y and solve for y. And by the way, on your multiple choice answers, your inverse function should be written, if your original function was f of x, your inverse function is going to be f with a little negative 1 up here and then of x. This is the inverse notation for the function when you find the inverse. So let's switch x and y and solve for y. So this is really saying y equals 3x minus 5. The first thing to do is to switch x and y. So you're going to go x equals 3y minus 5. And now let's solve for y by adding 5 here, adding 5 over here. You're going to have x plus 5 equals 3y. Final step will be to divide by 3 and divide by 3. So y equals x plus 5 over 3. Ladies and gentlemen, they're actually going to write it instead of y. They're going to write it as f, little negative 1 up on top, x, inverse notation, equals x plus 5 over 3. I hope this helps. So on B, you're going to do the same thing. Instead of g of x, let's just call it y. So let's say y equals 2x plus 9. We're going to switch x and y, so that's going to be x equals 2y plus 9. And then we're going to solve for y, subtracting 9. Subtracting 9, we're going to end up with x minus 9 equals 2y. So the final step would be to divide by 2 to get y by itself, divide by 2. So your final answer is going to be written as this on the multiple choice. It's going to be f of -1 to the x, that's the inverse notation, equals the x minus 9 over 2. That's your final answer for the inverse function. Okay guys, I'm switching from my classroom loud voice to my creepy voice. Yeah, okay, so number 11A. No, okay, I'm sorry. Anyways, but yeah, I'm not going to be talking that loud, so I apologize if it seems like I'm whispering. Anyways, we first need to identify H and K, and that tells us our shifts, right? So our H value is always going to be inside parentheses with X, and you always have to think opposite. So that will be a -2 for the H value. That means you're going to shift 2 that way. And the K value is the number that's being added or subtracted at the very end, in this case 0. So that means that you're not moving up or down. So now that we've identified H and K, the next step is to ignore H and K. Okay, ignore H and K. So let's actually go to a XY plane now, and let's get our coordinates to our parent graph. And there's certain numbers that you want to plug in here. You don't want to plug in negative numbers because then you get imaginary values, and this is a real XY plane. So let's plug in numbers that work. For example, let's plug in 0. The square root of 0 is 0. Plug in 1. The square root of 1 is 1. Plug in 4. The square root of 4 is 2. Plug in 9. The square root of 9 is 3. And if we plot these points, let's plot the 0, 0. That's at the origin. Okay. And then we plot 1, 1. And then we plot 4, 2. 1, 2, 3, 4, and up 2. There it is. Now the 9, 3 is off the graph, but I'm not going to do that. Anyways, this is a parent graph, so we need to actually shift it according to our H and K that we have up here. So let's shift these 3 dots 2 units to the left. So I want to do the shift and the final dots in red. So 2, if I take this point right here and move it 2 this way, I'll end up right there at -2. So as you can see, I shifted all of the coordinates 2 units to the left according to our H value, 2 units to the left, 2 units to the left. And now we have our final graph that's in red right there. So let me actually draw it. Sorry, that came out kind of ugly. But anyways, this is also an inequality. As you can see, inequality. So our answers are either going to be below or above. So it'd be a good idea to simply plug in a value. Like let's say we wanted to plug in a coordinate like 1, 1, okay? Let's check the coordinate 1, 1. So that means I'm going to plug in a 1 for X and a 1 for Y and see if it gives me a true statement, okay? So if I do plug in a 1 for X and a 1 for Y, it's going to say 1 is greater than or equal to the square root of 1 plus 2. So we really have 1 is greater than or equal to the square root of 3. So if you did the square root of 3 on a calculator, you get 1.7. So you really have 1 is greater than or equal to 1.7, which is false, right? That's not true. So this point right here did not work. No, it didn't work. So that means that the points on the other side work. So it's just going to be straight up above the curve, and that's the correct matching answer that you need to find on the multiple choice. Now, if it would have worked, then you would have shaded the inside or the bottom part of that curve. So right here, the H value is -3. That means it's going to go 3 to the left, the shift. And K is -1. That means you're going to go 1 down, the shift. Anyhow, now that we know H and K, we ignore H and K. And let's just graph this thing with a quick XY table. Plugging in numbers that work, the square root of 0 is 0, the square root of 4 is 2, the square root of 9 is 3. So let's plot those points on the graph. I forgot 1, 1, I just put it in there. So 1, 1 is also on this graph. So before drawing it, let's shift 3 to the left and 1 down and put new red dots. So there's my new graph right there. And now, of course, we need to test a value to see whether we're going to shade in below the curve or above the curve starting at this point. Let's test 0, 0. 0 is less than the square root of 3 minus 1. Well, we said 0, we said the square root of 3 was 1.7 roughly, and take away 1, it's still 0.7, so it is true, so we shade in the bottom. that will be your answer on the final.